I'm glad you brought up Jeff Bezos. I'm glad because this is going to get us on topic. Jeff Bezos, I don't know if people caught the news, got his phone hacked by Saudi Arabia. The founder and chairman of Amazon, the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, tech guy, got his phone hacked, got his nudes stolen, presumably, whatever. They just took everything. In fact, the U.S. government, the National Security Agency, put out guidance late last month, talking about cloud vulnerabilities and asking people to account for hostile administrators. So they're concerned, it sounds to me, like, the cloud contractor they use, that being Amazon, could be compromised at the very top because of this hack. So why on earth would the Democratic Party, with all of this fuss about cybersecurity and the fact that, the agencies of the U.S. government with unlimited resources can't keep themselves secure, why would we put the vote on these machines? I mean,
well, I actually want to ask you that, because I said, you heard me in the beginning. I'm not opposed to, we're going to need to come up with a smart discourse that isn't, purely conspiratorial, but also I think, frankly, isn't just purely like, stuff happens. But I do want to go on this question of rationality and outsourcing. I was actually listening to a conversation the other day with Jerry Brown, of all people. To his credit, he was highlighting as a guy, I forget what the organization is, but he is, I think, Union of Concerned Scientists. And he was saying, I think he's the chairman of it now, or a similar group on proliferation. And he was actually making the point that in the history of possible nuclear conflict, and I know I have trouble with that word, deal with it, that not you, Corey, the pedants out there.
I understand.
That the reason that and I know you know this history, and maybe you can get into it a bit more, but there have been multiple false alarms. And we're not talking like, we're not talking about Cuban Missile Crisis, like the world is at the brink and diplomacy saves us and back channels. We're talking like a guy sitting at a computer terminal in Russia or Colorado, and they see something that looks like a strike. And instead of doing automatic protocol, they actually go, that seems weird. Maybe I ought to do some double checking before we initiate the end of human life systems. Now, in the arms today, Jerry Brown was saying, that is not possible because these are computerized. There is an automatic response in arms. At least to some degree, right? We had the false alarm in Hawaii in the context of the major escalation rhetorically around North Korea before, Trump decided that he was bonded to that kid. And yes, you also have Iowa. So, and Jeff Bezos, like, just focus on the just competence and delusion of technology component of this.
Well, the solution to all these problems that they're created by the computers is to not use networked computers to solve the problem, right? Like,
yep.
And you've got a bunch of people selling a solution to a problem that they've created. I mean, this company, Acronym, which is actually a nonprofit that invested in the company that made the app that screwed up Iowa, Shadow, a name that conveys, utter transparency.
And that one's for-profit, right?
That's the for-profit one.
Yes. So you already have this unusual situation, which much of the reporting is now sort of honing in on of, it's not unheard of for a nonprofit corporation to control for-profit companies, but it does raise like some flags that, auditors would be looking at. Somebody who wants to look at whether this whole arrangement is above board would be looking at. But on a much more fundamental level, yes, you're talking about a company that, if it can fix this problem, as I saw someone who's smart on tech finance stuff point out, if shadow, which created the problem, can fix it, then they'll never hurt for government contract work for the rest of the time that anybody that's involved with it has a life, because they've then created the fix. So created the problem and then sold the fix. It is a time-honored tactic of the tech industry. And, I'm honestly surprised to hear Jerry Brown expressing that amount of skepticism about technological solutions. I mean, Jerry Brown is almost the prototype of the new wave neoliberal corporate Democrat. A lot of them came out of the Obama administration. David Plouffe, for instance, who left to go work for Uber, was also involved in this company acronym. Anyway, Jerry Brown was once in the running to take over Steve Jobs' role as CEO of Apple when Jobs was forced out of that company.
Back in the 80s. I mean,
back in the day.
I think the paradox with Jerry Brown is that he's certainly, like, as far as like actual policies go, is certainly right-leaning neoliberal in most, certainly like fiscal areas, though he's got a populist streak which comes out sometimes. But I will say he's the only modern politician who has expressed he has a problem with standardized testing, and he critiques that, and he's got a problem with these automatic systems. And I guess that's something I want to get to that I think is really important, because I noticed, like, in the popular discourse, and even when people like you and I frankly level these critiques, there's one group, there's these two very dumb responses, I'm sorry to say. That's like the only word. I wish I could convey it more politely, or I don't know, knee-jerk, cliche, not thought out. And one is, okay, so you're just a Luddite. And then the opposite side of the same coin is, how could you say that? You are on YouTube, and you have podcasts, and you have phones and all this stuff. And of course, like, those are great. There's some real benefits to technology. No one is denying that. And secondly, just because we see the need for limits on the outsourcing of human capacity to technology and the obvious problems with it does not mean that all of a sudden we're just saying, like, yeah, that's right. Just, rip up the computer terminals, throw away your iPhones. Like, that's ludicrous. That's not what's being discussed. But those narratives are so prevalent. And anytime ideologically determined cliches like that become dominant, I always really want to know what's the market interest behind those narratives.
That's exactly why those narratives became dominant. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot more skepticism now about those kind of arguments than you were, say, 5 years ago. But they're industry narratives. Most of the journalism until a couple of years ago about the tech industry was produced by publications that were essentially advertising vehicles for the industry. They were not going to apply critical perspective to it, or even really a scientific perspective. I mean, this idea that there are tasks to which the application of technology, and specifically software, is going to improve the process is unscientific on its face. You haven't seen, for instance, a whole lot of computer security experts praising this company that was involved in the Iowa debacle, because anybody that is telling you that you need an app to count votes to do something that can be done with pencil and paper, and has reliably been done with pencil and paper for decades, if not centuries, is trying to sell you something. Because adding from a basic security perspective, adding complexity to the process just creates more opportunities for it to fail. And, the latest thing on that specific story today, ProPublica came out with a really kind of must-read piece about all the security problems with this app. This is something that you would expect people who are really upset about Russian hackers, for instance, in the 2016 election, to get very exercised about. And I haven't seen so much of that, presumably because, as you were discussing in your intro, the mistakes broke a certain way that, in this case, was favorable to some of the candidates those people might favor. So there you have my take on that. As to the bigger questions you brought up about techno-fetishism, yeah, these were industry narratives. I mean, people should, the criticism that it's Luddism, this critique is just simply being a Luddite. I mean, I hope people recognize the origins of that phrase and who Ned Ludd was. And stuff like that. I mean, is that a useful 10-second recap?
Please. Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah. So I believe he was English. I could be getting some very basic information wrong because I couldn't tell you. I just know 19th century, right? But we're talking about Industrial Revolution period and the introduction of machines essentially to make production more efficient and cheaper for factory owners by laying people off. Which is, really how technology is developed and the priorities under which it's developed under capitalism. So Ned Ludd was a union guy, basically, who said, screw these machines. These people aren't going to throw us out on the street and our families. We're not going to starve because of these machines. So they sabotaged them. And hence you had the Luddite movement. So there's a positive way to look at Luddism as well. I mean, it's as an assertion of, labor rights, which are human rights, really, over the interests of capital, when it uses technology to, lower living standards for the working class.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, that's such an important distinction because I don't even want to get, there is a whole other line of people that we can get into, and I think there actually is some thinking that we should retrieve from people like Ivan Illich and E.F. Schumacher, who, it's not my politics. I mean, I have a more Marxist politics, obviously, but there was a really smart critique coming particularly out of the 70s about technological complexity and the function it played in society and the ideas and the notion that basically a lot of institutions were replicating problems that they were designed to solve. And that's obviously persisted. I mean, that is a feature, not a bug, right? And so, but even that being said, that's a slightly different line. The Luddite line, as you say, is not, this guy wasn't like, oh, I want to live in the cottage in the woods and I'm tired. I don't want the big new machines, He was a laborer who was saying, these machines are going to get implemented to destroy our bargaining power, which is exactly how you would understand these things in a Marxist sense, right? And then the conversation flips, which is, of course, we want technological innovation. We want the capacity to improve our lives, the role it will play in cleaning up the environment and dealing with the ecological crisis. But that ultimately, whether it is your phone or whether it's something more ambitious, that these things will always pose massive societal problems, from cybersecurity to the next wave of brutal labor conditions to simply dissolving your personal space and monopolizing your attention unless it is brought out of a capitalist framework. That's definitional because technology is second order. It's not first order.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing. I mean, these tools, we need to control these tools, not the other way around. And that's part of the problem also with this app. I mean, I still haven't seen a story that explains how the contracts were awarded in this process, and that's something I'd like to know. In my mind, there's still fundamentally a corruption story, and I want to get into that in a minute. But you don't even have to accept that whole Marxist critique of, technological determinism in order to see the problems with putting your democracy on an app, right? I mean, first of all, think about this caucus situation. I mean, why don't they use an app for the coin tosses? I mean, we're talking about a somewhat chaotic sort of personal process anyway. And the basic task, the only thing that needs to happen is somebody at point A, the precinct, needs to get the results over to headquarters, right? So a phone call would suffice, you would think, right? So it's got to go through this app. Now, my understanding is hundreds of questions about how to work this thing were coming in to the state party officials, before any caucuses actually happened. So what kind of training was provided for this, right? And who were the users? I mean, if you're developing a piece of software, that's the first question, right? Who's going to use this and for what? And were the people that running these caucuses, I mean, you know, not to stereotype or generalize, but the pictures I saw, I mean, these are older people. These are people who can volunteer their time to run a caucus in, you know, their neighborhood or whatever. Like, are they comfortable enough with their phone to even, like, can they use Facebook properly, let alone run and, like, manage this app? I mean, there's a basic failure, even if you accept, you know, the techno-utopian view that, you know, everything's going to be digitized and that's the way of the future. Like, even if you accept that, this was botched on, like, very basic sort of conceptual levels.
Right.
And if you want to say anything about that, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll just keep complaining about this.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.